The generator behind the aid station hummed the same note it always did, but Staff Sergeant Megan Foster couldn't stop hearing it like something underneath the sound was wrong. She sat on an overturned ammo crate outside the canvas flap, elbows on her knees, watching dust settle on her boots in the floodlight. Inside, 2 flight medics were finishing the paperwork that would put Specialist Lena Dunn on a bird to Bagram by morning, and from there to Landstuhl, and from there to a life that didn't include the rest of her left leg below the knee. Megan had been allowed in for exactly 4 minutes. Dunn had been awake, gray-faced, working hard to keep her voice steady. "Tell Ramirez it wasn't him," Dunn had said. "Tell him before he convinces himself otherwise." Megan said she would. She hadn't told him yet. She didn't know how to say it in a way that would actually land, not after what he'd seen. 3 days now since the Wadi crossing. 3 days of replaying the same 40 seconds. The call she'd made to push the patrol through the low ground instead of holding for the alternate route. The half-beat of hesitation when the order came down. The sound that followed it. She could recite the sequence the way some people recited prayers, evenly, automatically, looking for the place where it could have gone differently. She hadn't found it yet. She wasn't sure there was one single place. That was almost worse. She heard boots in the gravel and looked up to find Private Ramirez standing a few feet off, not quite looking at her, holding his rifle by the sling the way you do when you need something to hold on to that isn't a conversation. He was 19. He joined the Army 11 months ago wanting, in his own words, to be part of something that mattered. He hadn't said more than a dozen words to anyone since the patrol. "Sergeant," he said. "Ramirez." He didn't say anything else. After a moment, he just nodded, like he'd confirmed something to himself, and walked on toward the barracks tent. Megan watched him go and thought about Dunn's message sitting unsent in her chest like a stone. Inside the squad's living area, the silence had a texture to it. She walked through on her way to find Sergeant Cole and noticed how nobody was talking over each other the way they used to, how meals were happening at separate times instead of together, how somebody, she suspected Cole, had quietly moved Dunn's empty cot and footlocker to the far corner, out of the main sight line, as if that would help. She found Cole outside the supply tent, a clipboard under his arm. He was 31, 6 years in, the kind of NCO who didn't waste words, which was usually a strength. Tonight it felt like a wall. "Got a minute?" she asked. "Filling out a packet," he said, not looking up. "Lateral transfer request. Figured you should hear it from me instead of finding it in the system." She didn't argue with him. There wasn't a version of that argument she trusted herself to win right now, not when some part of her understood exactly why he wanted out. "Okay," she said. "I'll sign off when it's ready." That seemed to surprise him more than if she'd pushed back. He looked at her for the first time, something unreadable passing over his face, and then went back to the clipboard. She found Lieutenant Bishop in the command tent 20 minutes later, the radio traffic low in the background, a stack of incident reports under a flashlight. Bishop was new to the platoon, 5 months in country, and still had the careful posture of someone who hadn't yet decided how much weight his own decisions carried. He told her, without much preamble, that Battalion was opening a formal review of the patrol. Routes, comms, the call to push through the low ground. Her name would be in it. So would his. "Until it's done," he said. "Your squad's off the rotation. I'm sorry, Foster." "It's not a judgment. It's procedure." "I understand," she said, and meant it, and still felt something settle in her chest like a held breath that had nowhere to go. "For what it's worth," Bishop added, "nobody up the chain thinks you did this on purpose." "That's not really the question, sir." He didn't have an answer for that. Neither, really, did she. Later, alone in her tent, Megan sat on the edge of her cot with her boots in her hands, turning them over like she might find something written on the soles. 6 soldiers were under her today who hadn't asked to lose a teammate, who hadn't asked to start flinching at radio static, who were watching her, she knew they were watching her, to see if she still believed she had the right to walk them out the wire again. She wasn't sure she did. She set the boots down by the cot, laces loose, ready for morning, and lay back without turning off the light. Tomorrow she would have to decide anyway. Chaplain Rousseau had a way of sitting that made silence feel less like a void and more like a place you could rest. Megan found herself in his tent the next afternoon, not because she'd planned to, but because her feet had taken her there after PT formation broke up early. Nobody had the heart to run drills, and she hadn't pushed it. "You don't have to talk," Rousseau said, setting 2 cups of coffee on the folding table between them. "I'm told that's a common misconception about this tent." She almost smiled. "Almost. I keep going back to it," she said instead. "Looking for the moment I could have stopped it." "Did you find one?" "No, that's the problem." He didn't fill the silence after that, and she found herself filling it instead, telling him things she hadn't said out loud to anyone in this deployment. About her father, mostly. A quiet man who'd done a tour in Vietnam and never once described what it was like, who kept a single photograph from those years in a drawer and nothing else, who died when Megan was 23 without ever explaining why he flinched at fireworks. She used to think his silence was strength. Lately, she wondered if it was just a wound nobody had taught him to treat. She told Rousseau about her divorce, 4 years back. The way the army had become the thing she rebuilt herself around when everything else had come apart. How she'd thrown herself into this squad, 18 months now with most of them, not because she was chasing some idea of glory, but because it was the first place in a long time where her competence had mattered to someone besides herself. She knew Cole's daughter's name, his ex-wife's, the custody schedule he didn't talk about. She knew Ramirez sent half his pay home to a mother in Texas. She knew which of her soldiers needed a direct order and which needed to be asked. None of that showed up in an evaluation report, but it was the actual work of leading people, and she'd been good at it. She still believed that, even now. Especially now, when believing it felt dangerous. What she didn't tell Rousseau, because she'd told it to herself so many times already it had worn smooth, like a stone in her pocket, was the sequence of the patrol itself. It hadn't started with one bad decision. It started 2 hours before step-out, when Battalion changed the march order on short notice, folding 2 squads into a single patrol to cover a gap left by another unit's maintenance delay. It continued with a local translator's warning about activity near the Wadi crossing, a warning that made it into the net call but got compressed, in the noise of a busy frequency, into a single clipped line that nobody flagged as urgent. It continued with Megan standing at the fork in the route, low ground to the left, the longer way around to the right, weighing 20 more minutes of exposed movement against a crossing that had been quiet for 3 weeks running. She'd made the call. Low ground, faster, and on paper, defensible. The blast had come from the left flank, not the route itself, a detail that would matter enormously to the official review and mean almost nothing to anyone who'd been there. Dunn had been third in the file. The patrol had reacted inside of 4 seconds, which by any honest measure was fast, was right, was exactly what 18 months of training together should produce. It hadn't mattered enough. That was the part she couldn't make sense of, sitting in Rousseau's tent with coffee going cold in her hands. They had done almost everything right, and it hadn't been enough, and there was no clean lesson in that. No villain. No single point where a different choice would have changed everything. Just a translator's warning thinned out by radio static. A march order changed 2 hours too late, and her own voice saying low ground with a confidence she'd earned over 18 months and would now spend a long time questioning. "It would almost be easier," she said finally, "if I just screwed up. If there was one thing." "Would it?" Rousseau asked. "Or would you just be looking for a different stone to carry?" She didn't answer that. On her way back to her own tent, she passed Dunn's old bunk, still in the corner where Cole had moved it. The footlocker sat closed, but someone, probably whoever had packed Dunn's personal effects for shipping, had left a single sheet of paper on top, folded in half, addressed to Dunn's sister in Ohio. Megan picked it up without quite deciding to. "Hey, Case," it read, in handwriting that started neat and got looser toward the bottom. "Things have been good out here, believe it or not. The squad's solid. Sergeant Foster runs us hard, but she's the real deal. The kind of NCO Dad would have liked. I think for the first time since basic, I actually feel like I'm part of something that... It stopped there. Mid-sentence, mid-thought, the rest of the page blank. Megan stood holding it for a long time before she folded it carefully back along its original crease and set it down exactly where she'd found it. The weapons cleaning station was supposed to be the safest, most routine thing on the FOB. Soldiers sitting in a loose circle on ammo cans, breaking down rifles they'd cleaned 100 times before, talking about nothing in particular while their hands did work that didn't need their full attention anymore. That was the whole point of it. Muscle memory, built so deep that even on a bad day, the steps held. So when Specialist Davies reassembled his weapon, checked the chamber, and started to call it clear without waiting for his battle buddy to confirm, without the verbal back and forth that had been automatic for this squad since before Megan even took over as their NCO, it took everyone a second too long to notice. It was Ramirez, of all people, who caught it. "Hold up," he said, voice flat, eyes on the rifle instead of Davies. "Confirm with me first." Davies froze, looked down at his own hands like they belonged to someone else, and went pale. Sorry, I just... "It's fine," Ramirez said, too quickly, and the moment passed the way these moments do, with everyone going quiet and going back to their own weapons and nobody quite looking at anybody else. Megan, standing 20 feet away with a clipboard she hadn't actually been using, saw the whole thing. She didn't say anything in the moment. There was nothing to correct that hadn't already corrected itself. But she felt it land somewhere low in her chest. This squad didn't make that kind of mistake. Or hadn't. The fact that it happened at all told her something she already suspected and had been avoiding saying out loud. The dysfunction wasn't staying contained to grief and quiet meals. It was starting to show up in the work. She mentioned it to Lieutenant Bishop that evening, mostly because procedure required she log it, and he received the news with the particular stillness of a man who'd been waiting for an excuse to say something he didn't want to say. "Foster, I have to be honest with you," he said. "Battalion's asking questions about whether this squad needs to stay intact. There's been talk of redistributing personnel. Spread your people across other units. Let them reset somewhere that isn't carrying all this." "They don't need to be scattered," Megan said. "They need time. Time's not free out here, and if something like today happens on an actual mission instead of a cleaning station..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "Give me the chance to fix it," she said, "before anyone makes that call." Bishop studied her for a moment, and she could see him doing the math that every junior officer eventually has to do between trusting the NCO in front of him and protecting himself if it goes wrong. "I can buy you some time," he said finally. "Not much." She thanked him and walked out into air that felt thinner than it should have. Cole found her an hour later by the water buffalo near the motor pool, and he didn't bother with any kind of preamble. "You heard about today," he said. It wasn't a question. "I was there, Cole." "Then you know it's not just Davies. It's all of us. Ramirez doesn't sleep. Davies can't finish a function check without his hands shaking half the time." "And you..." He stopped himself, jaw tight, and then decided to finish it anyway. "You made the call on that route, Sergeant. I know it's not my place to relitigate it, but you're standing here acting like you're the one who's going to fix this, and some of us are wondering if you're the reason it needs fixing in the first place." It hit the way honest things hit. Clean, no padding around it. Megan didn't flinch away from it, mostly because she'd already said worse to herself in the dark more times than she could count. "You're not wrong to ask that," she said. "I've asked it myself every night since. I don't have an answer that makes it smaller than it is. I made the call. It was defensible with what I knew at the time, and it still cost Dunn her leg, and I have to live with both of those things being true at once. So do you. So does everybody in this squad." Cole didn't say anything to that. His jaw worked like he had more to say and was choosing not to. "But I'm not going to stand here and let Battalion break this squad apart because we're hurting," Megan went on. "Scattering everyone doesn't heal anything. It just means 6 people carry this alone instead of together. Together didn't exactly work out for Dunn, Cole said, and the words landed harder than he'd probably meant them to. She saw it cost him something to say it. Megan didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked to the command tent, got on the satellite line, and spent 20 minutes navigating hospital admin lines until a nurse at Landstuhl agreed to bring a phone to Dunn's bed. She called the squad together that night. No explanation, just told them to be in the common tent at 1900. And when Dunn's voice came through the speaker, thin but unmistakably hers, the whole tent went still in a different way than it had been still all week. "Hey, losers," Dunn said, and somebody made a sound that might have been a laugh trying to climb out from under something heavier. She talked for a few minutes about the hospital food, about the physical therapist who already scared her more than basic training had. And then, without anyone asking her to, she said the thing Megan had been carrying since the aid station and hadn't found a way to deliver herself. "I know what's going on in your heads right now, because I know all of you," Dunn said. "So I'm going to say this once. None of you did this to me. Not Foster, not Ramirez, not any of you. It happened. I need you all to still be a squad when I get back, because that's the thing I actually miss. Not the leg. You." Nobody said much after the call ended. Ramirez sat with his head down for a long moment before he got up and left without a word. Davies wiped his face with the back of his hand, not quickly enough to hide it. Cole looked at Megan across the tent, and something in his expression had shifted. Not resolved, not forgiven, but cracked open in a way that let a little air in where before there had only been the silence. It didn't fix anything. Megan knew better than to think one phone call could undo what 4 seconds at a Wadi crossing had broken. But for the first time in 3 days, the quiet in that tent felt like something they were sitting in together, instead of something each of them was drowning in alone. There was no single morning where things turned around. Megan understood that going in, the same way she understood that rebuilding trust wasn't a thing you announced and then had. It was a thing you did, in pieces, on a schedule nobody else could see. She started with the SOPs. Not because the squad's standard operating procedures had failed exactly. The after-action review would eventually conclude the reaction to contact had been textbook, but because going through them line by line gave everyone a task that wasn't about feelings, and because she genuinely wanted to know what each of them would change. She sat down with every soldier individually, including Davies, including the newest private who'd barely said 3 words since joining the squad, and asked the same question each time. If you could change one thing about how we move, what would it be? Most of the answers were small. Davies wanted a second verbal confirmation built into weapons handling, even back at base, even when it felt redundant. He wanted the redundancy, he said, because his hands didn't trust himself right now, and an extra check felt like armor. Ramirez wanted comms procedure tightened, so that any warning from a local source, however it came in, got repeated back on the net before anyone moved. It was a small thing. It wouldn't have changed what happened at the Wadi. The translator's warning had made the net call, just thinned out by static and urgency. But it was something he needed to ask for, and Megan wrote it down without telling him that. She paired Ramirez and Cole on supply runs for 2 weeks straight, not as a punishment and not with any speech about teamwork attached to it. She just put their names next to each other on the roster and let the work do what it needed to do. They didn't talk much at first. By the second week, she heard them arguing about a football game on the drive back from the supply point, and the ordinary irritation in their voices was the most hopeful sound she'd heard in 19 days. She also did the thing that cost her the most, which was sit across a folding table from the battalion review board and refuse every off-ramp they offered her. The translator's warning was compressed in transmission, one of the officers said, not unkindly. That's a comms issue, not a command decision. I had the route choice in front of me regardless of how clearly that warning came through, Megan said. I chose the low ground. That's mine. Lieutenant Bishop's changed march order put you in a compressed timeline. The timeline was a factor. The decision was mine. She kept her hands flat on the table, kept her voice even. I'm not interested in spreading this thin enough that nobody has to hold it. I made the call. I'll answer for it. It would have been easier, probably, to let the blame diffuse the way these boards sometimes allowed it to. A little on the intelligence shop, a little on Battalion's last-minute reshuffling, a little on bad luck, until no single person carried enough of it to really feel the weight. Bishop, watching from across the room, looked like a man who half expected her to let him share it, and was visibly unsettled when she didn't ask him to. She caught his eye once, briefly, and gave the smallest shake of her head. Not yours to carry. Not like this. It cost her. The review's language, when it finally came down weeks later, would note a judgment error under time pressure next to her name, a mark that wasn't going to do her career any favors. She signed the acknowledgement without arguing. She brought back morning PT the same week, not as discipline, but because the squad needed one thing in the day that belonged to them and wasn't shaped by grief. The first run was quiet, almost grim, 6 soldiers moving through the gray light without talking. By the 4th morning, somebody, Davies, of all people, started counting cadence out loud again, badly, off the wrong foot, and Ramirez told him so, and for about 4 strides, the whole formation was laughing instead of running, which felt like the first genuinely unguarded sound the squad had made together since the Wadi. It was a Tuesday when Bishop found her after the morning formation, his face doing the careful bad news arrangement she'd learned to read over the past month. Battalion's leaning toward dissolving the squad after the review closes, he said, spreading everyone out. I fought it as far as I could, Foster, but the recommendation's already drafted. Something in Megan went very still and very clear, the way it sometimes did right before she made a decision she wasn't going to second guess. I want a meeting with the battalion commander, she said, not you relaying it. Me in the room. That's... Bishop hesitated. That's a big ask, going over the recommendation like that. I'm not going over you. I'm asking for 10 minutes to make a case nobody's heard yet, because nobody's been watching this squad the way I have for the last month. She held his gaze. They're not broken, Lieutenant. They're healing. There's a difference, and somebody with the authority to listen needs to hear it before this gets decided on paper by people who weren't there for any of it. Bishop looked at her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes that looked almost like respect, trying to surface through his own exhaustion. I'll set it up, he said. I can't promise it changes anything. It doesn't have to change everything, Megan said. It just has to buy us one mission. Let them show what a month of this actually built. After that, the squad can make its own case. The meeting with the battalion commander lasted 11 minutes, and Megan would later remember almost none of the specific words, only the feeling of saying them, steady, unhurried, laying out exactly what the squad had done in the 4 weeks since the Wadi crossing without once asking for sympathy. She talked about the rebuilt SOPs, about Davies's request for redundant verbal checks now written into their procedure, about Ramirez and Cole working a roster together without friction for the first time in a month. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She asked for one mission, low risk but real, so the proof could speak for itself instead of living only in her own account of it. The commander, a colonel with deep lines around his eyes and the unhurried manner of a man who'd sat through more of these conversations than he could count, didn't promise anything in the room. 3 days later, the orders came down anyway. Foster's squad would provide route security for a routine resupply convoy moving between 2 forward positions, a stretch of road that had been quiet for months. Not glamorous, not even particularly dangerous by the standards of the deployment. Which was, Megan understood, exactly the point. She gathered the squad the evening before and didn't give a speech. She just laid out the route, the contingencies, the radio procedure Ramirez had asked for built into the plan, and watched 6 people lean into a map the way they used to, voices overlapping with questions and corrections, nobody flinching at the sound of the grease pencil tapping against terrain. The mission itself, when it came, was almost anticlimactic, and Megan had never been so grateful for anticlimactic in her life. The convoy moved out at 0500 under a sky still holding on to its stars. Cole drove point with Ramirez riding shotgun, And twice during the route, Ramirez flagged something over the net. Once, a parked vehicle that turned out to be nothing. Once, a group of kids near the roadside that the convoy slowed for out of habit and caution. And both times the warning went out clean, repeated back, confirmed, the way he'd asked for it to be built into the procedure weeks earlier. Davies, in the trail vehicle, called out a function check before they even left the wire, waited the full beat for his battle buddy's confirmation, and didn't rush it, even though by now it was second nature again. Nothing exploded. Nobody bled. The convoy reached the forward position 4 hours later, offloaded, and turned around for the trip back. And if you'd asked any of them afterward what had happened out there, the honest answer would have been nothing and everything. Communication had held under the small frictions of an actual mission. Reflexes that had wavered at a cleaning station a month earlier had come back fully online when it mattered. Cole and Megan, working the radio together on the return leg, fell into the same rhythm they'd had before the Wadi, not needing to discuss who'd call what, just knowing, the way you know a person's voice in a crowded room. That evening, back inside the wire, Cole found her near the motor pool again, same spot as the night he'd confronted her weeks before. This time, he didn't have a clipboard. "I tore up the transfer packet," he said. "Figured you should hear that from me too." "Glad to hear it," Megan said, and meant it more than the simple words could carry. "I'm not saying it's all the way fixed," Cole added, looking out at the line of vehicles instead of at her. "Some of it's still going to be there. I think it's always going to be there a little." "I think that's probably true for all of us," Megan said. "Doesn't mean we can't still be good at this." Cole nodded slowly, like he was turning that over and deciding it was something he could live inside of. "Today was good," he said finally. It wasn't much. It was, from Cole, almost everything. The weeks that followed didn't erase what had happened at the Wadi. Nothing was going to do that, and Megan had stopped expecting it to. But the squad found its footing again in the accumulation of ordinary days. Missions that went the way they were supposed to. Meals eaten together instead of scattered. The particular ease of people who trusted each other enough to argue about nothing in the chow line. Ramirez wrote her a letter near the end of the deployment, the old-fashioned kind, folded and handed to her instead of texted, which told her something about how much thought had gone into it. He thanked her for not giving up on the squad when Battalion wanted to scatter them, for asking him what he'd change instead of telling him what he'd done wrong, for treating the whole thing like something that could be rebuilt instead of something that was simply broken. "I think about what Dunn said on that call a lot," he wrote near the end. "That she missed us, not the leg. I think I finally get what she meant." Megan read it twice and kept it, the way she suspected Dunn's sister back in Ohio had probably kept the unfinished letter that never made it home. Months later, stateside, the squad gathered for a dinner that had taken 3 different time zones and a lot of coordinating to arrange. Dunn called in on video from her sister's place in Ohio, sitting at a kitchen table, a prosthetic leg visible below the hem of her jeans, moving with a careful confidence that hadn't been there the last time Megan saw her. She laughed at something Davies said and threatened, not entirely joking, to come kick all their butts at the next squad PT session, prosthetic or not. Cole had re-enlisted by then, citing when pressed. Nothing more dramatic than the simple fact that he wasn't done with this work yet. Megan was offered a slot training other NCOs on leadership in the aftermath of mission failure, the kind of assignment that existed precisely because what had happened to her squad wasn't rare, even if talking about it honestly still was. She thought about turning it down. She thought about Ramirez's letter instead, about Dunn's voice coming clean through a hospital phone line, about a month of mornings where nothing dramatic happened except 6 people slowly remembering how to trust each other again. She said yes, standing in formation with her squad one final time before reassignment orders scattered them to their next postings, not broken apart by battalion this time, but by the ordinary current of military careers moving forward. Megan looked down the line at faces that had been hollowed out with grief 4 months earlier and now simply looked tired in the regular way, the human way. Not perfect, not whole in the way they'd been before the Wadi crossing, because that particular wholeness wasn't coming back for any of them, but present. Standing here together, because of nothing more remarkable than the daily, unglamorous work of choosing to be. And that's the story of Staff Sergeant Megan Foster and the squad that learned trust isn't rebuilt in one heroic moment. It's rebuilt one ordinary day at a time. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. See you in the next story.